There are moments in air combat when everything a pilot has been taught becomes a trap. Imagine you are in a heavy twin-engine fighter over the Pacific, looking up to see 4 enemy fighters turning toward you, each of them lighter, quicker, and designed from the ground up to win the very kind of duel you have trained your whole life to fight. Every instinct tells you to pull the stick, to turn hard, to meet them in the swirling circle where aces make their names. But one young pilot over Bougainville chose to do the exact opposite. That choice, which looked like running away, opened the door to a completely new way of fighting that would eventually flip the entire balance of the Pacific Air War. If you enjoy real stories like this about pilots and engineers who changed history by thinking differently, please consider subscribing to the channel so you do not miss the next deep dives into forgotten tactics and machines. On an April morning over Bougainville, First Lieutenant Rex Barber pushed the nose of his P-38 Lightning down through thin cloud at about 14,000 feet. He was 23 years old with more than 70 combat missions behind him and not a single confirmed victory over a Japanese Zero. Every previous meeting with the famous White Sun fighters had followed the same script. American pilots tried to turn with them. The Zeros turned tighter, guns found their mark, and the Lightning that was supposed to dominate the Pacific ended, up trailing smoke into the sea. As 4 Zeros banked to meet him, Barber began a dive that would break that script in a way no one expected. For years, one fact had been drilled into both sides of the conflict: the Zero could outturn anything in the sky. Mitsubishi's slim, lightweight fighter could carve tight circles that seemed to defy physics, while the big twin-boom P-38 was heavy-wide and built more like a high-speed interceptor than a nimble duelist. In the Solomon Islands alone, since the start of January 41, P-38s had been lost. 27 of those had died exactly the same way in turning engagements where American pilots tried to match the Zero's circle, watched the Japanese fighter slide inside their turn, and never lived to regret the mistake. The Japanese pilots, looking up at Barber's descending Lightning, were expecting the usual pattern. They were ready for him to break left or right, to flatten out into the familiar horizontal arena, where turning skill and quick reaction would decide everything in seconds. Instead, Barber did something that made no sense to a traditional fighter pilot. He refused to turn at all. He held the nose down and kept his P-38 in a clean vertical dive. The airspeed needle crept past 350 miles per hour, then 400, then more. Down below, the Zeros rolled into their own dives engines, howling as they tried to keep the big American fighter in their sights. But very quickly, the people in those Japanese cockpits could feel the difference. Their engines were straining at maximum power, their aircraft beginning to shudder their controls, growing heavier as the pressure of the slipstream clamped down on ailerons and elevators. For the Zero pilots, there was an invisible line they dared not cross. Somewhere around 430 miles per hour, they knew from bitter experience that their aircraft could simply come apart. Push past their safe dive speed and the airframe could begin to vibrate violently, control surfaces could lock, and in the worst case, the fighter could shed its wings in mid-air. Each pilot had to make a choice: pull out early and live, or try to follow the Lightning into the abyss and possibly die without ever firing a shot. Rex Barber had no intention of backing away from that line. He drove his P-38 deeper, feeling the airframe groan and the twin Allison engines roar as the speed climbed toward 460 miles per hour. It was a terrifying place to be, but Lockheed's big fighter was built with a stronger structure than the fragile Zero. When Barber finally hauled back on the control yoke, the Lightning held together. He roared out of the dive roughly 2,000 feet below the Japanese formation, still moving fast and now in level flight. That extra speed became his lifeline. While the Zero pilots were still recovering from their aborted dives, trying to stabilize their aircraft and claw back altitude without overstressing their wings, Barber was already racing away. Within moments, he had opened a gap of several miles and had begun climbing on the far side of the combat area, out of reach and out of danger. He had survived a meeting with Zeros without ever giving them the turning duel they were waiting for. What saved him was not superior aim or tighter turns. It was the choice to refuse the fight as the enemy defined it. The narrator of this story points out that Barber's escape depended on understanding a hidden advantage of the P-38 that most pilots had been ignoring. Viewers are invited to keep watching to see how that advantage was discovered and turned into doctrine, But first, the story returns to the young man in the cockpit and the world he had been trained in. Since the days of biplanes over the Western Front in World War I, fighter pilot culture had grown around a few simple rules. You did not run from a fight. You did not dive away and leave an opponent behind you. You turned, you climbed, you tried to get your guns onto the enemy's tail. The pilot who maneuvered more aggressively and held his nerve longer became the ace. Diving away from danger looked like cowardice. Yet on that Bougainville morning, diving away was the only reason Barber was alive. Elsewhere in the same sky, 2 other P-38 pilots had tried to do things the traditional way. Neither returned. One of them, Second Lieutenant Julius Jacobson, made his fatal decision at about 8,000 feet over Empress Augusta Bay. When a Zero swung toward him, he did exactly what every manual and instructor had always taught. He turned to meet it. The Japanese pilot hauled his fighter around in roughly 4 and a fraction seconds. Jacobson's P-38, heavy and wide-winged, needed just over 7 seconds to complete the same circle. That gap of a few seconds was enough. For about 3 full seconds, the Zero had the American in its sights. 20mm cannon shells slammed into the left engine and cockpit. Jacobson's Lightning exploded in mid-air. He was barely 20 years old, with just over 80 combat hours, and he died because he followed doctrine against an enemy for whom that doctrine had become a trap. The reason was baked into the metal of the aircraft themselves. Mitsubishi had designed the A6M0 around a single brutal requirement: turn faster than anything else. To achieve that, they shaved weight everywhere. Empty the Zero weighed a little over 5,000 pounds and was driven by a single radial engine of just under 1,000 horsepower. The P-38, by contrast, weighed more than 12,000 pounds empty and carried 2 engines generating more than 1,000 horsepower each. On paper, the Lightning had more than twice the total power. In a turning fight, power alone did not matter as much as weight and wing loading. Tests and combat experience made the difference painfully clear. The Zero could hold roughly a 5G turn at about 230 miles per hour. The P-38 needed to be close to 290 miles per hour to approach that turn rate, and even then it struggled to sustain much more than 4G forces. In a prolonged circular fight, the Japanese fighter would complete 2 full circles in the time it took the Lightning to make barely 1.5. That advantage gave Zero pilots the freedom to cut inside the American turning circle again and again until they found a firing angle. Japanese aviators understood this very well. Over New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, they had studied the limitations of the big American twin. When P-38s appeared on the horizon, Zero pilots would immediately pull into hard turns and climbing spirals, dragging their opponents into a flat horizontal carousel. Empty the Zero weighed a little over 5,000 pounds and was driven by a single radial engine of just under 1,000 horsepower. The P-38, by contrast, weighed more than 12,000 pounds empty and carried 2 engines generating more than 1,000 horsepower each. On paper, the Lightning had more than twice the total power. In a turning fight, power alone did not matter as much as weight and wing loading. By the beginning of 1943, the statistics on these encounters were stacking up on the desks at 5th Air Force Headquarters in Brisbane. In the month of January alone, P-38 squadrons in the Solomon Islands flew over 1,000 combat sorties and reported close to 200 engagements with Zeros. They claimed around 400 enemy aircraft destroyed, but in return they lost 27 P-38s, specifically to Zero fighters. That worked out to a kill ratio of roughly 1.5 to 1. Given the resources of the United States and its supposed training advantage, barely breaking even was not good enough. Major General George Kenney, who commanded 5th Air Force, had actually fought to get the P-38 into the Pacific Theater. On paper, it looked ideal. Twin engines offered reliability over vast stretches of open ocean. That advantage gave Zero pilots the freedom to cut inside the American turning circle again and again until they found a firing angle. Japanese aviators understood this very well. Over New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, they had studied the limitations of the big American twin. When P-38s appeared on the horizon, Zero pilots would immediately pull into hard turns and climbing spirals, dragging their opponents into a flat horizontal carousel. All of the heavy armament, 450 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon sat in the nose, which meant no need to worry about wing gun convergence. A pilot simply pointed the entire aircraft like a spear. With external drop tanks, the P-38 could fly roughly 1,300 miles, giving it the range to escort bombers deep into Japanese territory and bring its pilots home again. Part of the problem lay in where American doctrine had been written. Instructors at training bases in California were preparing fighter pilots for German opponents, not Japanese ones. The standard lessons emphasized turning with the enemy, trying to get inside his circle, and firing when he crossed the gun sight. Against aircraft like the Messerschmitt 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190, that advice was often sound. Those German fighters were powerful, heavily armed, and capable of fierce, high-speed attacks, but they behaved more like heavy fighters when forced into sustained turns. Given enough altitude and energy well flown, American aircraft could sometimes outturn them. The Zero was a completely different animal. It could turn like nothing the Americans had ever faced. Japanese training reinforced this strength. Young pilots spent months on formation work, then aerobatics, then live fire gunnery before they ever saw combat. Many could hold a 4G turn for more than a minute without losing altitude, snap roll at 200 miles per hour, and come out pointing directly at an opponent and claw their way from sea level to 10,000 feet at nearly 3,000 feet per minute. The United States Navy had already learned through blood at Coral Sea and Midway that its F-4F Wildcat could not hope to match that kind of maneuver. Out of that pain, naval aviators had developed the famous thatch weave. Two Wildcats would fly together, crossing paths repeatedly, while avoiding more than a quarter turn at a time, and keeping their speed above roughly 250 miles per hour. When a Zero latched onto one Wildcat's tail and tried to turn with it, the second American fighter would swing through the crossing point with a clear side shot at the Japanese aircraft. This tactic did not pretend to outturn the Zero. It used teamwork and energy to trap it. By the late summer of 1942, the kill ratio in those Navy units had improved dramatically. However, what worked for Navy squadrons in carrier groups did not translate easily to Army Air Forces units in the South Pacific. The thatch weave required pairs of pilots who trusted each other completely and had practiced the maneuver over and over until it became instinct. 5th Air Force squadrons were constantly receiving new replacement pilots, while experienced men rotated home once they finished their tour. Units rarely stayed stable long enough to develop that level of cohesion. On top of that, official doctrine in the Army Air Forces prized individual initiative, aggressiveness, and offensive spirit. To many, the thatch weave looked defensive, reactive, and even unmanly. So P-38 pilots kept going into turning fights alone, and they kept dying. Rex Barber understood that surviving one fight by diving away was not the same as winning a campaign. Escape was not victory. If he and his fellow pilots could not find a way to exploit their aircraft's strengths to actually shoot down Zeros, they would simply live to face the same hopeless odds the next day. To see how he began looking for that advantage, it helps to understand where he came from. Barber grew up in the tiny town of Culver, Oregon, on a cattle ranch set on the high desert plateau. His childhood was not filled with glamorous flying stories, but with long days riding horses, mending fences, fixing broken tractors, and dealing with animals that outweighed him by many times over. Out there, survival did not belong to the strongest man who could wrestle the hardest. It belonged to the person who could outthink problems, who knew how to use the land, the tools, and a little bit of cleverness. His father taught him a lesson that would stick in his mind long after he traded a saddle for a cockpit. A man who weighed only a little over 100 pounds could never hope to wrestle a 1,200-pound steer to the ground by brute force. But the same man with a good rope and a solid fence post could control that animal completely. The key was leverage. Find the advantage. Use the advantage. Win without trying to meet strength head-on. Barber carried that idea with him when he joined the Army Air Corps in 1941. In flight training at Mather Field in California and advanced training at Luke Field in Arizona, he did not stand out as the most naturally gifted stick and rudder pilot. What set him apart was how seriously he took the numbers. While many classmates went into town at night to drink and relax, Barber stayed with the technical manuals. He memorized power curves and climb rates, studied maximum speeds at different altitudes, and learned how fuel consumption changed with power settings. He paid close attention to structural limits, to the margins between what the aircraft could handle in theory and what it could survive in practice. When he finally reached the Pacific in September 1942, and joined the 339th Fighter Squadron at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. That homework had given him a habit of thinking in terms of performance envelopes rather than just gut feeling. His first combat mission, escorting B-17 bombers against Japanese targets at Bina, brought no enemy contact. It was a gentle introduction that taught him little about fighting Zeros. The real lesson arrived on his second mission. On an October day, Barber found himself and two other P-38 pilots facing 7 Zeros at around 12,000 feet. The Japanese fighters did exactly what they always did. They turned in at once, trying to drag the Americans into the circular arena where the Zero was king. Over the radio, his flight leader, Captain Mitchell, shouted a warning that went against everything Barber had been trained to do. Break off, dive away. Do not turn with them. For 2 long seconds, Barber hesitated, caught between his drilled instinct to fight and the shouted order to run. In those 2 seconds, a Zero slid onto his tail and opened fire, punching 20mm shells through the right boom of his Lightning. The P-38 shuddered and began trailing smoke, but its twin engines and strong structure saved him from instant destruction. Barber shoved the nose down and dove for his life, making it back to Henderson Field with an aircraft that would take more than a week to repair. On the ground, Mitchell tore into him, repeating the words that would echo through Barber's mind: never turn with a Zero. If you turn with them, you die. What Mitchell could not yet explain was the next obvious question that Barber now had to answer for himself. If you cannot turn, how do you fight at all? In the aftermath of that furious debriefing, Barber walked away from Captain Mitchell's words with a strange mixture of clarity and frustration. Never turn with a Zero. The warning was absolute, delivered with the authority of a man who had watched too many pilots die trying. Yet the order only sliced away one half of the problem. It told him what not to do without offering anything to put in its place. The young lieutenant now found himself caught between the official doctrine that still glorified tight-turning dogfights and the harsh battlefield reality that punished anyone who tried to live up to that ideal. Somewhere between those 2 poles there had to be a new answer. Barber's instinct was not to shrug and accept mystery. He went back to the one refuge that had always made sense to him: numbers. If brute force turning fights were forbidden, then the solution had to be hidden in performance charts and technical manuals. He pulled the available data on both the Japanese fighter and his own Lightning and spread it out like a puzzle. Maximum level speeds at typical dogfighting altitudes, he noticed, were not dramatically different. At the moderate velocities where pilots usually fought the Zero and the P-38 could run close to the same pace in level flight. That meant the key would not be found in a straight-line race across the sky. The real divergence appeared when he studied dive characteristics. The columns of figures describing the Zero's behavior in the vertical did not look like mere fine print. They looked like a warning label. Japanese pilots had learned through painful experience that their sleek little fighter carried a hidden curse when pushed beyond a certain point. The maximum safe dive speed for the Zero hovered around 340 miles per hour. Beyond that, several ugly things began to happen at once. Control surfaces started to stiffen. The ailerons responsible for rolling the aircraft lost authority as the air pressed harder and harder against them. The elevator which pitched the nose up and down grew so heavy that pilots struggled to move it at all. Pilots described the onset of severe vibration at around 360 miles per hour, a shudder that rattled through the entire airframe. That vibration was not simply uncomfortable. It was a warning that the airloads were approaching what the structure could bear. There were already recorded cases of Zeros breaking apart in dives at speeds above roughly 400 miles per hour. Everyone who flew the aircraft knew that pushing past 350 miles per hour in a dive was gambling with his life. The invisible line that had forced Barber's pursuers to pull out above Bougainville was not superstition. It was a hard limit written in metal and rivets. When Barber compared those figures with the P-38's dive envelope, the contrast was like stepping from a cramped room into a vast open plain. The Lightning could safely dive to about 460 miles per hour in normal operations and could briefly touch close to 480 miles per hour in a true emergency, although no one recommended making a habit of that. The key insight was simple and profound. Between the speed a Zero could survive and the speed a P-38 could endure, there was a gap of a little more than 100 miles per hour. That gap was not just a number, it was a door. Barber realized that the vertical axis of the sky, which most pilots treated as simply a way to enter or exit a turning fight, could become a highway that only American pilots could drive at full speed. If he refused to slow down and refused to flatten out into a circle, he could live in a band of speed and altitude where the Zero simply could not follow without risking structural failure. On the 3rd of November 1942, he set out to test that theory deliberately. On combat patrol over the stretch of ocean known as the slot, Barber spotted 3 Zero fighters at about 11,000 feet. Instead of maneuvering horizontally to get behind them, he climbed his P-38 up to around 15,000 feet and then tipped the nose over into a clean, controlled dive. He let the Lightning accelerate until the airspeed indicator moved past 420 miles per hour and then pulled out, crossed below and beyond the Japanese formation, and climbed back up to roughly 14,000 feet on the far side. The Zeros tried to pursue, but they simply could not match his rate of acceleration in the dive or his climb back to altitude. He had just moved through their airspace like a stone dropped through water, emerging unharmed where their hands could not reach. It worked beautifully as a method of escape, but escape was not the same as victory, and Barber knew it. He could leave, but he could not yet arrive in a way that brought his guns to bear. The next piece of the puzzle came from another pilot whose mind also ran on engineering lines, Captain Thomas Lanphier of the 70th Fighter Squadron. Lanphier approached air combat like a physics problem. He talked not about turn radius and gut feeling, but about energy states. An aircraft in flight, he explained, held energy in 2 forms. The speed of the airplane was kinetic energy. The height of the airplane above the ground was potential energy. A pilot could trade one form for the other. Diving converted altitude into speed. Climbing converted speed back into height. The fighter that could manage its total energy more intelligently would dominate regardless of who could carve the tighter circle at low speed. In that framework, the strengths and weaknesses of the Zero and the P-38 suddenly snapped into focus. The Japanese fighter was a master of low-energy combat, slower speeds, tight spirals, quick, close-range shots where its light weight and huge control surfaces let it dance. The Lightning was clumsy in that world, but it excelled at high-energy fighting. With more powerful engines and a strong structure, it could climb better above about 15,000 feet, accelerate more strongly once it passed 300 miles per hour, and plunge through the vertical at speeds that would tear a Zero apart. The answer, Lanphier argued, was not to try to beat the Zero at its own game, but to change the game entirely. He laid out a revised form of what pilots already called boom and zoom. The classic tactic involved diving from altitude, firing in one fast pass, and then climbing back up rather than staying to dogfight. Lanphier tuned that idea specifically to the realities of the Zero. He insisted that every engagement should begin with a clear altitude advantage of at least 3,000 feet. When P-38 pilots spotted Zeros below, they were not to cut horizontally into a turning merge. They were to dive straight down building speed to 400 miles per hour or more. As they slashed through the enemy formation, they would line up a single firing pass, squeeze off a short burst, and then continue the dive, pulling out below the Japanese fighters. Once clear, they would use that very speed to extend away in level flight, and then gradually convert it back into altitude in a long, steady climb. If a Zero tried to follow them down, it would be forced to pull out early as it approached its own dive limit, leaving the Lightning below and ahead, still accelerating. If the Zero chose not to follow, then the P-38 would simply climb back up to the starting perch and repeat the process. At no point were pilots to allow the engagement to slow and flatten into a turning circle. Everything about the fight had to be fast and vertical. Lanphier's logic led to a brutal but clear rule set. Never turn with a Zero. Never fight at slow speed. Never give away altitude without gaining something in return. Always keep enough energy in the bank that you can choose when to attack and when to leave. The Zero could only really hurt a P-38 if the American willingly stepped down into the narrow turning ring where Japanese training and design ruled. The goal was to make that decision unnecessary, even unthinkable. 5th Air Force took these ideas seriously enough to build an entire training program around them in December 1942. P-38 pilots began to fly exercise after exercise that forced them to practice high-speed diving attacks against friendly aircraft simulating Zeros. They learned how fast closure rates looked and felt when they were hurtling toward a target at 400 miles per hour. They practiced squeezing off accurate bursts of fire with only a second or two in the firing window. They drilled on judging the right moment to begin pulling out of the dive so that they did not overstress the airframe yet also did not throw away too much of their hard-earned speed. Those drills did not just test machines, they pushed human bodies to their limits. When a pilot pulled too hard coming out of a fast dive, the forces on his body could climb to 7 or 8 times the force of gravity. Most men lost consciousness somewhere above 6 times the force of gravity. A blacked-out pilot in a plunging fighter was only a few heartbeats away from becoming a smoking crater. Through trial and error, they learned to pull out using around 5 times the force of gravity, which was still punishing but survivable. That meant beginning the recovery earlier, which preserved more altitude and kept more total energy available for the next maneuver. The pattern of their attack path, seen from the side, traced a long striped arc, a kind of spiraling ribbon of dives and climbs. Fellow pilots began to refer to the maneuver half-jokingly as the barber pole, a nod to the man whose near-fatal experiences and stubborn tinkering had helped define the new way of fighting. On the 15th of January, 1943, these ideas hardened into official law. 5th Air Force issued explicit tactical guidance to all P-38 squadrons facing Japanese fighters. The orders stated that Lightning pilots were to engage only when they held an altitude advantage. In combat, they were to maintain speeds above roughly 350 miles per hour, use diving attacks exclusively, and under no circumstances attempt sustained turning engagements. This was not framed as a suggestion. Pilots who violated the guidance could be pulled from combat status. To men who had grown up on stories of knights of the air, it felt at first like cowardice written into doctrine. Fighter pilots were supposed to charge to mix it up to seek the decisive duel. Yet the numbers written in blood over the Solomons told a different story. If they clung to chivalry in the sky, they would lose the campaign and leave Japanese air power dominant. Commanders began to argue that true courage was not measured by how tightly you could turn, but by whether you could abandon comforting myths in order to win. As this painful mental shift spread, pilots like Rex Barber were encouraged to think less, like jousters searching for honorable single combat, and more like ranchers looking for leverage. They were not there to entertain anyone with perfect dogfight circles. They were there to use every structural advantage their aircraft possessed to break the enemy's will. Very soon they would find out whether this new philosophy worked when real bullets were flying. The test came quickly. On the 19th of January, a dozen P-38s from Barber's group met 18 Zeros over New Georgia. In earlier months, that imbalance might have spelled disaster. Japanese pilots would have turned immediately spiraling upward and inward, and several Lightnings would likely have gone down in flames while the rest scattered. This time the Americans stuck to their rules. They held their height, then rolled into dives, plunging toward the enemy at roughly 410 miles per hour. Each made a single fast pass fired, and then extended away to climb again. The entire engagement lasted barely 11 minutes. When it was over, 5 Zeros were falling or burning. Not a single P-38 had been lost. From the Japanese perspective, the fight was profoundly unsettling. Instead of brave enemy pilots meeting them in the familiar swirling melee, the Americans seemed to dive, shoot, and run away again and again. Some Zero pilots muttered that the Lightning men were cowards, but they could not ignore the fact that this supposed cowardice was leaving them with smouldering wrecks and empty cockpits. The pattern behind those baffling encounters was simple. The P-38 did not have a secret reserve of hidden maneuverability. Its wings had not magically shrunk. Its turn radius had not improved. The hidden advantage was speed in the vertical. Its strong structure and twin engines allowed it to operate in a slice of the flight envelope that the Zero could not touch. As long as Americans kept every fight fast and high diving and climbing, instead of circling and twisting, the genius of the Japanese design became irrelevant. The statistics that followed in the next few months made the case more loudly than any briefing. In January, Japanese fighter units in the Solomons reported shooting down 27 P-38s. In February, that number dropped to 9. In March, it fell again to 4. At the same time, P-38 squadrons claimed roughly 730 enemy aircraft destroyed in that same month of March. The kill ratio had flipped from roughly 1.5 to 1 in favor of the Japanese to around 18 to 1 in favor of the Americans. As pilots continued to refine their methods, they discovered that details mattered. They learned that the ideal attack began from about 5,000 feet above the enemy formation. Starting from lower than that did not give the Lightning enough room to build a serious speed advantage. Starting from much higher wasted time in the dive and made the closure rate so high that aiming became difficult. They worked out that the best range to open fire was around 400 yards and that they should cease firing at about 200 yards. Any closer, and they risked colliding with the target or being struck by debris from a disintegrating aircraft. They also experimented with the shape of their pullouts and the precise altitude at which to begin them. The consensus formed that they should start recovering from the dive roughly 2,000 feet below the altitude of the enemy formation. That margin provided enough room to avoid overloading the airframe while still preserving enough speed for a clean horizontal extension and climb. Even the choice of ammunition and gun configuration became part of the new playbook. The most effective setup turned out to be 450 caliber machine guns in the nose, loaded with armor-piercing incendiary rounds combined with a single 20mm cannon firing high explosive shells. The Zero by design had almost no armor and lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. It had been built to be light and agile, not tough. A handful of 50 caliber hits through the engine or cockpit could cripple it. A single well-placed 20mm shell into a fuel tank could ignite the aircraft in a blossoming fireball. Pilots came to understand that they did not need to blow every Zero out of the sky on the first pass. Damaging one wing holing a radiator or wounding the pilot was often enough. A crippled Zero could no longer dogfight effectively. It had to break away and try to limp back to base, and in doing so it became the perfect target for another diving pass. 20 seconds later, from the same P-38 that had just climbed back into the sun. From the moment the new tactics proved themselves in blood, they did not stay confined to one group of squadrons for long. Word spread quickly across the scattered islands and coral strips of the South Pacific. The 13th Air Force adopted the same energy fighting principles, drilling its own P-38 pilots in high-speed dives and disciplined single-pass attacks. Naval officers watching the changing statistics with interest requested briefings on what 5th Air Force had done. They wanted to adapt the same ideas for the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, the new carrier fighter that was beginning to replace the older Wildcats, and for the gull-winged Chance Vought F-4U Corsair that the Marines were flying from rough, forward fields. Bit by bit, almost every American fighter community in the Pacific began to bend its doctrine toward the same central truth: speed and altitude were weapons, not just background conditions. By the time the calendar reached April of 1943, a simple mantra had taken hold among the pilots who lived and fought under the Pacific sun. Do not dogfight Japanese fighters. Stay high, stay fast. Attack from above, extend away, climb back and strike again. It was passed around in ready rooms, written in chalk on blackboards, repeated in mission briefings, until even the newest replacement pilot could recite it. The heroic image of two fighters circling each other in an honorable duel did not disappear from imagination, but it no longer guided tactics. Survival and victory now belonged to those who treated the sky as a three-dimensional energy problem. Against that backdrop of changing doctrine, a very specific mission took shape, one that would turn these abstract principles into a blow at the heart of Japan's naval command. American codebreakers had been reading parts of the Japanese naval communication system, and in the spring of 1943, they intercepted a message that made intelligence officers sit up straight. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and the strategic mind behind much of Japan's Pacific campaign, would be flying from the stronghold of Rabaul to an outlying airfield at Balal. The message included times, altitudes, and routes. For once, the Air Force knew exactly where and when a single aircraft carrying an irreplaceable leader would be. The plan that followed, codenamed Operation Vengeance, pushed the P-38 to the very edge of what its tanks and engines could sustain. 18 Lightnings would lift off from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal and fly more than 430 miles, one way, skimming just above wavetop height for most of the journey in order to stay below Japanese radar. The margin for navigational error was slim. If they missed their interception point by even a few minutes, Yamamoto's flight would be gone, and the P-38s might not have enough fuel to make it home. According to the decoded itinerary, the Admiral would be aboard one of two Mitsubishi G-4M bombers, escorted by 6 Zero fighters cruising at around 4,500 feet. To give the mission the best chance of success, the American formation was divided into two clear roles. 4 P-38s, under the leadership of Captain Thomas Lanphier and including Rex Barber, would form what planners called the killer flight. Their task was simple and deadly: destroy the bombers. The remaining 14 Lightnings formed the cover flight. For once, the Air Force knew exactly where and when a single aircraft carrying an irreplaceable leader would be. The plan that followed, codenamed Operation Vengeance, pushed the P-38 to the very edge of what its tanks and engines could sustain. 18 Lightnings would lift off from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal and fly more than 430 miles one way, skimming just above wavetop height for most of the journey in order to stay below Japanese radar. As the Zero pilots saw American fighters high in the sun, they instinctively began to turn and maneuver in an attempt to force the usual kind of engagement, one in which tight circles and clever knife fighting might give them the upper hand. Instead, the P-38 stayed with the plan. 14 Lightnings rolled over almost in unison and dropped into near-vertical dives. Their airspeed raced past 400 miles per hour as they plunged through the altitude band where the Zeros were trying to turn. Once again, the Japanese pilots ran headlong into the structural wall of their own design. As their instruments crept toward 350 miles per hour, they could feel the controls stiffen and the airframe begin to shudder. None of them were eager to discover what would happen if they pressed on into the range where other Zeros had broken apart. One by one, they were forced to pull out while the American fighters continued downward, overshooting beneath them and then using their excess speed to arc away and climb back into the heights. Without firing a single shot, the cover flight had dragged the escorts out of position, leaving the bombers exposed. Below, Lanphier and Barber led the killer flight in a descent aimed directly at the two G-4M bombers. The lumbering Japanese machines had already dropped to treetop level, hoping to use the jungle canopy as concealment, but there was no hiding from fighters attacking out of the sun with all the energy advantage that doctrine demanded. Barber fixed his sights on the second bomber in line. At around 400 yards, he opened fire, his 450 caliber guns tracing a line of impacts that walked steadily up the fuselage. Then his 20mm cannon shells found the right engine. The power plant erupted and the right wing failed under the sudden stress, folding up and tearing away. The bomber rolled over and plunged into the jungle below. Yamamoto, the most important Japanese naval commander of the war, was on board that aircraft. Lanphier focused on the lead bomber with the same ruthless method. Diving at high speed, he lined up a brief firing window, unleashed a concentrated burst, and then pulled away. The G-4M staggered, trailing smoke and flame, then lost control and smashed into the sea several miles off the coast. In a matter of moments, both high-value targets were down. The 6 escorting Zeros survived the engagement physically, but they had been stripped of the chance to do the very thing they existed to do. They had failed to defend their charge, not because the Americans outturned them, but because the Americans refused to turn at all. Yamamoto's death sent a shockwave through the Japanese Navy. The combined fleet had lost its most experienced and imaginative commander. In the months that followed, naval planning grew more cautious, more rigid, and less willing to risk bold maneuvers. Yet the way he had been killed carried a different kind of lesson. A single carefully planned application of energy fighting had sliced through elite escorts and struck directly at the heart of the enemy's command structure. Tactics, not notions of chivalry, had decided the fate of a man who had once seemed untouchable. As the year continued, the same logic that had shaped Operation Vengeance was applied again and again on a broader scale. By May of 1943, American fighters effectively controlled the skies over the Solomon Islands. Japanese air strength had not vanished overnight, but it was no longer able to contest every raid. Bombers flew against airfields, supply dumps, and shipping with fighter cover that used height and speed as shields. Each engagement bled away a little more of Japan's finite pool of skilled pilots, while American losses shrank. What had begun as a campaign of grinding attrition that hurt both sides now became a one-sided wearing down of the enemy. The statistics for that month made generals back in Washington take notice. P-38 squadrons flew more than 3,200 sorties, met Japanese fighters in a little over 200 engagements, and claimed almost 150 enemy aircraft destroyed. In return, only 9 P-38s were lost in air-to-air combat. That was a kill ratio of roughly 16-1. In June, the ratio rose to around 21-1. In July, it climbed again to approximately 24-1. The numbers were not perfect, and claims always contained some exaggeration, but the trend was undeniable. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, was no longer the apex predator. By August, Japanese fighter units in the Solomons were making a simple, brutal calculation. Unless they outnumbered American formations by a wide margin, they hesitated to attack P-38s at all. Even when they believed that they had the numerical advantage, they often broke off engagements if the Lightnings refused to come down from their altitude perch and be dragged into slow-turning fights. The psychological balance had flipped. The same pilots who had once felt invincible in their lightweight, tightly turning aircraft now felt hunted by an enemy that seemed to appear from above, strike, and vanish before they could respond. In this new environment, the P-38 Lightning emerged as the dominant American fighter of the Pacific. Production lines in the United States turned out a little more than 10,000 of the twin boom machines over the course of the war. In the Pacific theater alone, their pilots claimed roughly 1,800 aerial victories. Among those pilots was Major Richard Bong, who would become the leading American ace with 40 confirmed kills, all achieved in P-38s, and all using the same basic principles of energy fighting. Bong was known for his calm discipline in the cockpit. He did not chase turning duels or try to match the Zero at its own game. He dove, fired, extended, and climbed again and again until his tally exceeded that of any of his peers. Rex Barber's record was more modest in terms of raw numbers, but no less significant in its implications. He flew more than 100 combat missions, and was credited with 5 confirmed victories, including the bomber that carried Yamamoto. After the war, when Operation Vengeance was finally declassified decades later, and historians came calling, Barber did not pose as a swashbuckling hero. He said simply that he had done what he and his squadron had been trained to do: dive fast, shoot straight, and never ever turn with a Zero. His story embodied the shift from romanticized dogfighting to cold, calculated energy management. When Barber left the Air Force in 1946, he did not seek the limelight. He returned to Culver, the small Oregon town where he had grown up, and ran a hardware store there for nearly 4 decades. To his neighbors, he was less a legendary pilot than a steady local businessman. He died in July of 2001 at the age of 80. The town eventually named a park in his honor, and the Air Force named a building at Luke Air Force Base after him. Yet his deepest legacy lived in the way later generations of pilots thought about the sky, even if they had never heard his name. Thomas Lanphier also carried his ideas forward into the post-war world. As he rose to the rank of colonel, he wrote extensively about fighter tactics and aircraft design. In the 1950s, he argued that the experience of World War II had proven a hard truth that designers ignored at their peril. Pure maneuverability measured in tight turn rates at low speed was overrated. What mattered more was the ability to manage energy to keep speed in hand and to control the vertical dimension of a fight. A fighter that could climb, strongly accelerate quickly, and dive safely through high-speed regimes could dictate the terms of an engagement in ways that no pure-turn fighter could match. For a time, the institution he served seemed not to absorb that lesson fully. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, many American fighter programs still placed a great deal of emphasis on turn performance and maximum instantaneous maneuver. The jets that emerged were often fast at high altitude but sacrificed sustained energy management for sleek lines and tight theoretical turning figures. It was only when the United States found itself in another air war, this time over the jungles and rice paddies of Vietnam, that the bill for those choices came due. In the skies above Southeast Asia, American fighters found themselves engaged with North Vietnamese pilots flying agile MiG-17 and MiG-21 fighters. In many early engagements, the Americans allowed themselves to be lured into exactly the kind of tight-turning battles that had once doomed P-38s against Zeros. Aircraft that looked excellent on paper struggled to maintain energy and loss rates climbed in a way that alarmed commanders. In response, the Air Force began to rediscover concepts that Barber and Lanphier had lived out decades before. Energy management, vertical maneuver, and disciplined engagement rules returned to the center of tactical thinking. The next generation of American fighters reflected that relearning in metal and composite. The McDonnell Douglas F-15 and the General Dynamics F-16 were both designed from the outset as energy fighters. They had powerful engines that gave them high thrust-to-weight ratios, wings and control surfaces, shaped to sustain turns without bleeding away too much speed, and structures capable of withstanding high G-forces during hard vertical maneuvers. Their designers did not try to make them the tightest turning aircraft at low speed. Instead, they aimed to build machines that could maintain control of the fight by staying fast, climbing strongly, and diving through airspace in ways opponents could not safely follow. In that sense, they carried forward the same philosophy that had once allowed P-38s to dominate Zeros in the Pacific. Seen from this perspective, the duel between the Zero and the Lightning becomes more than a historical curiosity. It turns into a clear illustration of how opposite design philosophies create complementary strengths and weaknesses. The Zero was optimized almost single-mindedly for turning combat. Its low weight, low wing loading, and lack of armor made it superb in close-range, low-speed engagements. Those same qualities made it fragile and dangerous to fly at very high speed. The P-38, on the other hand, was heavy and not especially graceful in a flat circle, but its strong structure and powerful engines gave it unmatched dive capability. For 2 years, American pilots tried to use the Lightning as if it were a giant Zero, and paid the price. Only when they accepted what it actually was and fought in a way that emphasized its true strengths did they turn apparent disadvantages into decisive advantages. Today, engineering schools and military academies still use the story of P-38 versus Zero as a case study in adaptation. The airframes themselves did not change radically between early losses and later victories. What changed were the tactics, the mental model of the fight, and the willingness of leaders to rewrite doctrine in the face of evidence. It is a reminder that technology alone does not decide outcomes. How people choose to use that technology matters at least as much. As the narrator of this story reaches the end, he invites viewers to think about what the tale of Rex Barber, Thomas Lanphier, and the P-38 has to say about the balance between raw performance and clever tactics. He asks whether this changes the way they picture air combat in World War II and encourages them to share their thoughts. He wonders from which part of the world they are watching, whether from California, Australia, Japan, or somewhere else entirely, and whether any of them had family members who flew fighters in the Pacific skies. The video closes not just as a lesson in history, but as an open door for a community of people who care about real stories of real pilots, engineers, and machines that only reveal their true power when someone figures out how to use them in the right way.